go on a journey. Let's look at how local history can be incorporated into the large narrative history that exists. Within Oceana County, during the spring to fall of 1944 and spring to fall of 1945, German prisoners of war from Rommel's Afrika Korps were placed within subcamps at two locations in Oceana County, one at the Hart Fairgrounds and one at the Shelby High School football field. Regarding this event in local history, the Local Historical Society does a great job incorporating this event into the narrative of natural history. Additionally, they go further on to preserve the records, exhibit these records, and then make an interest in the subject with the local community, particularly the students in middle and high school. So I hope you all come with me on this journey as we explore a little bit behind the nature and experiences of the German prisoners of war in Oceana County, and also look at how the Local Historical Society is going about and following through organizing these records.
I'm standing in front of the Oceana County Fairgrounds, formerly known as the Hart Fairgrounds. This is one of the two subcamps that existed housing the German prisoners of war here in Oceana County. The secondary location was located about 10 miles south at the Shelby High School football field. Unfortunately, it's a little difficult to film there given that the school is still currently in session. However, we can still imagine what this camp looked like given the photos that still survive. Now, the nice thing about the prisoners being put here in an encampment from the spring to fall of 1944 is that these prisoners did not have to deal with the very cold temperatures I am currently experiencing here outside in November. Regardless, these prisoners enjoyed a fairly simple life. They stayed here in their tents, enjoyed time to read, and when they were not doing those activities, they were assigned under the Federal Emergency Labor Program designed by the Department of War and local farmers to work on surrounding farms and in canning factories in order to deal with the very large labor shortage that existed at the time. This labor shortage resulted in these prisoners having to go into the local camps throughout Oceana County and pick various crops. These would be things such as apples, cherries, and beans. One resident whom I interviewed years ago, who was a teenager at the time, fondly remembers that they hated picking beans. They absolutely hated picking beans. But they still did the work to the best of their ability. Now, how does this fit into local history? Well, simply because there are residents around who still recall the German camps in the area. They recall the Germans going to and from their work sites in the back of open air trucks, singing in the German language, and for the most part, being very docile, very well behaved. There were very few issues, though newspapers do report there was one or two instances where they did attempt to escape. They were subsequently recaptured, given that they were wearing clothes with the words PW. They did not speak English, and to be quite honest, here being a very agricultural county, there is hardly anywhere for them to actually go where they wouldn't be. So if they weren't trying to escape or working on farms, they were sent to processing plants like the one behind me. Now, sadly, I am unable as of yet to confirm whether or not this plant behind me is in fact the Royal Canning Company, which was the primary company worked by the prisoners of war during the 1940s. The Royal Canning Company, as told from the prisoner's perspective, was very well run. So after leaving the canning processing plant. We are now here standing in front of the Oceana County Historical Society, the place that houses the local information concerning the German prisoners of war. One particular individual, whom letters that they have, who wrote back to the royal family because of how well the canning factory was run and how well they were treated, was Mr. Royal. Writing back, Mr. Willie Buck stated that he wished Mr. Royal and the canning company would send preserves, because the canning company, as he recalled, made thousands of preserves every day, and they were extremely hungry and desperate. Being desperate for food, the German prisoners, as seen from the letters housed here, were constantly asking their American employers, so to speak, though they were their captors, to please send aid. This could be things such as clothes, but it was primarily food. Now, these letters that are stored here are the originals. They're not copies. They're not laminated. One volunteer here at this society has more than once called them treasures. She finds them very, very dear. The majority of them are written in German, have been translated, and some are written in a very heavy cursive script in English. Regarding local history, this historical society does very good incorporating the concepts laid out by Kirsten Loing, Elizabeth Nix, and Rebecca Schirm in their book Introduction to Public Health, Interpreting the Past, Engaging Audiences. These three aspects are audience, collaboration, and reflective process. Now, the Oceana County Historical Society engages their audiences with these personal letters, or these treasures. They collaborate with the local high schools and other local areas, businesses, in order to give presentations about the local history in World War II to get students interested in the subject. And then they're very reflective in using this to try and find other ways to integrate it and make it more interesting to the students. Why is this important? Because it uses the past and shows history through the eyes of the prisoners, allowing visitors and others to consider the effects of propaganda and stereotypes associated with the German prisoners prior to actually working with them. For example, many people thought that the German prisoners were simply Nazis versus average people, as experienced by local residents here in Oceana County who worked with the prisoners on a daily basis. They were just regular people. Granted, they didn't speak English, but they were still hard workers. They looked just like the boys that had gone off to war, and they weren't necessarily any different. So in regards to the local history in the area, it's very rich regarding the German prisoners' experiences and how they interacted with the local community. But the big thing that the Historical Society is involved in, and the primary context here, is integrating this local history into the overall narrative of World War II. These prisoners sent back letters to the Americans. One in particular was Willie Buck's letter. Willie Buck's letter asking for food can be put into the larger confines of the narrative, simply because he was repatriated back to Germany, was asking for help from the Americans, and then realized that the Americans were not as bad as people thought. Additionally, having camps in World War II places it into the narrative of World War II, because this idea of having prisoners of war in the United States is not a subject readily talked about. Therefore, we can add a whole nother element into this narrative that needs to be looked at further. Not only do we need to look at the fact that the story is not told, we need to look at the fact that sometimes propaganda isn't what it seems, and an enemy is not necessarily an enemy. They could just be an average person. Willie Buck sent a letter asking for help. Help may or may not have been granted, but it still caused a journey, one which the local community continues.
And that concludes our presentation. Thanks for going on the journey with me. It's great to see how Willie Buck's story can be incorporated into the local history here through his experiences with the Royal Canning Factory, as well as into the narrative of World War II history as it stands. We can incorporate the fact that Willie was a German prisoner of war. We can then incorporate the fact that after being a German prisoner, he was then repatriated back to Germany. And we can place the whole event into the confines of World War II. Looking at the Oceana County Historical Society, we can see how they have gone through to preserve this local history, whether it is keeping the letters securely in a box at their organization, whether it is taking diagrams and binders and taking these into the local high schools. But most importantly, not only do they engage the audience, not only do they collaborate with their peers and people around the area, they go further on to reflect and figure out ways to get better. Hope you all enjoyed this presentation.